Hola clase. So basically, Kim and Sierra put me in charge of completing the first question of our presentation, outdoors, which is, what is the nature of the society depicted in the text, and what seems to be the author's attitude or tone towards society? Is this unjust? Why? Well, the very first lines of the book kind of give us some insight into what the society is about. Hi, Mom. Because 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 they talk about they immediately say that money is a big determining factor in the society of Pride and Prejudice of Victorian England, and that because Austen uses the word universally acknowledged, it just shows that the belief that money is very important isn't just isolated to one case, it's sweeping. And I'm sorry, my mom is like leaving for work. But anyway, so depicted a very hierarchical, money-based society is depicted in Pride and Prejudice. And because Jane Austen, obviously the author of the book, like spends so much time ridiculing people who fit into this stereotypical mold of a person who cares so much about money, like the Bingley sisters, Darcy at times, and Miss Bennet, whose ultimate goal is just to acquire wealth through the marrying of her daughters, um, shows that I guess this is awkward. Jane Austen is like really opposed to this view of society. So I guess you could say that she agrees with the Marxist point of view because she thinks that what is important is not money. It's what life is, what the way you live your life is like. Um, and so the next question is this society unjust? Yes, this society is unjust, coming from a Marxist standpoint, because people like Lady Catherine de Bourgh do not deserve as much wealth as they have compared to the rest of society. And Austen goes throughout the entire socioeconomic spectrum, beginning with the poorest, like Mr. Wickham, who has to borrow money just to be able to live, um, to the highest in society, which are Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who was even made a lady by the Queen of England. So it is not fair. It is very stratified, and it's the opposite of what our literary lens would favor. Oh, 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 yeah.
I will be addressing question number 2, um, and I'm going to be addressing the first part right now. That is, Jane Austen does offer her own version of a better society, which is evident through her characterization of Elizabeth. For example, Elizabeth is shown as being very well read, always reading a book, very musically inclined, things like that, and those things would imply that she's very well educated and very mature and really pursuing interests that during this time many women did not pursue. And the characterization can be seen throughout the entire book, but specifically in chapter 1, she's described as having a book in her hand while walking, which both of those are not something women do in this time period. And the fact that Austen shows her main character, which is Elizabeth, as being so well read and so educated, shows that she believes that a better society would entail that women were more like Elizabeth. If women were more well read, if they acted more like her rather than what society wanted them to be during that time, Austen believes that society would be a better place. Also, addressing the problems of society, Austen does this throughout the entire book, but one of the best examples is her characterization of Charlotte Lucas. Charlotte Lucas does not have a husband at age 27, and in this society that's considered a stigma. And she's the entire time anyone makes an allusion to her or anything, she's thought of as a very poor character. And eventually she does have to marry Mr. Collins, which she does not love, which happens in chapter 21. When Elizabeth is questioning her, why did you marry Mr. Collins? She says that for the simple fact that she just needs the security of marriage. And this is Austen's way of portraying a big problem in this society, which was marriage in itself. That it was not for love or anything like that. It was more marriages of convenience were more that they happen more often than not. which Austen definitely saw as a big problem.
Okay, so I'm also going to be addressing a portion of question 2, and basically it's asking if Austen pays attention to the poor people of society, and in Pride and Prejudice I don't believe she does represent them well. She's putting this great emphasis on this constant class struggle to rise above where they are. From the get-go, we have Mrs. Bennet, trying to force her 5 daughters upon these wealthy, rich men and marry them off. And that's just, a very prominent motive throughout the whole novel, I think. And, we have, Mr. Wickham, who's trying to use Darcy and his family's money to boost his own status. And it's just this constant class struggle that Austen's criticizing. And yet she doesn't really pay attention to the people in the background, like the servants and those people. She's really just focusing on this superficial upper class that everyone seems to be trying to become. But like Sierra said, she does offer her solution in Elizabeth, I think, that, she is what society ought to be. She's educated and independent, and, she believes in finding love, and it doesn't matter to her, whether it be a rich man, So yeah, basically I think that Austen's just, she seeks to, reveal this silly class struggle and criticize it, and basically just offer Elizabeth as the model, her vision and her solution for what society needs to aim for.
Yeah.
So now we're going to take a little bit closer look at the society of Pride and Prejudice and see if we can draw any connections between the portrayal of the people and their social roles. And so if we start with the rich people, we first have Bingley, who is sort of the quintessential good guy of the novel. He's nice, he's got great manners and good looks, and everybody likes him. And after Bingley, there's Darcy, who is also a good guy in his own right, but the society can't see it because they're blinded by his pride. And so you might think that, oh, all the rich people are portrayed as good, but no, it goes downhill from there. We have Miss Bingley, who tries to use her social standing rather than any good character traits to pull Darcy away from Elizabeth, who is his love. And we have Lady Catherine, who is rude and has horrible manners, but she doesn't know it because she thinks that with her wealth she can do anything. And so we get sort of a good mix from the rich people, and we'll see the same thing with the middle class. We start with Elizabeth, who is the chief protagonist of the book, and she's smart and she's nice and she's a good girl, and we have Jane, who is almost good to a fault, as she sees the best in everybody and is not pessimistic at all and does not want to think ill of anybody. But again, it goes downhill. We have Mrs. Bennet, who is silly and socially inept but doesn't know it. We have Charlotte, who starts out as a good girl, the friend of Elizabeth, but later on she marries for money reasons and estranges her from Elizabeth a little bit. And finally we have Mr. Collins, who becomes Charlotte's husband, and the author herself describes Mr. Collins as not a sensible man, and his mannerisms and his speech throughout the parts where he's involved are pretty ridiculous. And so we see that in both instances, rich and middle class, that the poor aren't addressed in this novel. We have a good mix of good people and not so good people, and the point that Austen's trying to make with this is that social class has nothing to do with personal character, and so the amount of money that someone has doesn't determine how good they are as a person. And so it shows that Austen is wholly against the status quo of the compartmentalized society that it is right now, because it's not indicative of what people really are. And in addition, we see that it's also detrimental, as it leads to Darcy being misjudged because of his pride, which is seen as not good in the society, and it leads to Charlotte, a perfectly good girl, doing something that's not so good because of the constraints of this society.
Question 4. Do we know how much money each character has or earns, and do we have a sense of the source of this income? The answer to the first question is going to be largely a yes, and the answer to the second one is going to be largely a no. First, we're going to go through some of the characters in the novel and what we do know about how much money they have. First, the rich characters. Mr. Darcy is said to have an income of £10,000 per year. Miss Darcy has an inheritance of £30,000. Mr. Bingley is said to both have an inheritance of £100,000 and an income of £4,000 to £5,000 per year. Finally, the Miss Bingleys have an inheritance of £20,000. Now, for some of the less well-off characters. There's Mr. Bennet, who makes £2,000 per year, and Mrs. Bennet, who inherited £4,000 from her father. There's also Sir Lucas, who is said to have made a tolerable fortune. We don't know exactly how much this is, but evidently it's enough for his family. As for the sources of income, the main source mentioned throughout the novel is inheritance. We are told of the professions of a few of the characters. Mrs. Bennet's father made the £4,000 she inherited by working as an attorney, for example, and Sir Lucas made his tolerable fortune through trade in Meryton, presumably some sort of a merchant or businessman. Overall, however, we know little about the professions of the characters in the story. We are often told that people are going into town for business, but we have no idea what this business consists of. The effect of this is that, as readers, we understand that the important thing in this society is not hard work or one's job, but rather family, connections, and inheritance. Other than Mr. Collins, in fact, the only method of economic mobility pursued by anyone in the novel is marriage. If one wants to be rich, one must either have been born rich or marry someone who was born rich. Clearly, from a Marxist perspective, this is not a fair societal structure. There are distinct social classes, which is bad in of itself, and furthermore, these classes are extremely rigid and in no way fair to the members of this society.
Oh, 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 yeah.
Okay, so my first question is, how much attention does the author pay to the detail to the characters' everyday lives? And I think that Jane Austen pays a really good deal of detail to the characters' everyday lives, and this is best exemplified in the conversation between Catherine de Bourgh and Elizabeth at their meeting at Rosings. And so it's in page 140 and 141 in my book, but it asks, like, do your sisters play and sing? And then Elizabeth replies, one of them does. And so you get a really good sense of their hobbies. Elizabeth really likes to read, and Mary plays and sings. And also, more importantly, it talks about, it says, has your governess left you? We never had any governess. And then it's like, no governess. And basically this kind of reveals the social class of the time and how it's expected that families, they would have a governess to help raise the children. And the fact that the Bennets would not have a governess shows this kind of breaking away from the establishment of the society, as well as exemplifying that they're members of a lower class than Catherine de Bourgh, who considers this would be kind of like uncivil not to have one. And then the second question is the representation realistic, or does the author misrepresent reality? Why? I don't think that the world of Pride and Prejudice is totally unrealistic, but I do believe that it definitely is not as realistic as it could be, just because both Jane and Elizabeth, who are more of a middle class, upper middle, but still middle class, end up with really wealthy men, Darcy and Bingley. And this is even exemplified when Darcy is proposing to Elizabeth. It's in 160 in my book, but it mentions here, it's like, eloquent. He was not more elegant on the subject of tenderness than of pride. His sense of her inferiority, of its being a degradation of the family obstacles which judgment had always opposed to the inclination were dwelt on with a warrant would seem due to the consequence he was wounding. So basically, even as he's proposing, he goes on to talk about how he doesn't want to rejoice in the inferiority of her birth. And so this is kind of realistic, because he's speaking as someone who would have been expected to marry someone of his same class. But ultimately they do end up together, and that's perhaps more unrealistic than what would have actually happened during this time, so maybe it is a little more romanticized. And furthermore, the character of Elizabeth is a lot more modern than I expect. She believes that she deserves to have someone who she loves and loves her back, not just because she's a woman who needs to end up with a rich guy, but because she's a person who deserves to be in a relationship which she wants and respects. So, yep, that's